All right, guys, we are here today with Barry Eisler, author of one of my favorite books of all time, which is why I was so happy to finally get him on. If you don't recognize that title, once upon a time it was Rainfall, I believe. Uh, and all of the John Rain novels, loved all of those. Got a new book out called The System, though. This is a standalone. So if you're afraid of hopping into a new series, this one does give you a nice quick read by itself. Barry, I like to ask everybody who comes on the channel, what is your supervillain origin story?
Hi, Edward. It's nice to be here. My supervillain origin story. I've always liked writing and I've always liked reading. So I was a big reader when I was a kid, and I used to write little short stories and things like that. Uh, Wherever I worked, whether it was at the CIA or at a law firm or in a Silicon Valley startup, I always became known as the guy to go to if you needed some kind of writing done, business plan, marketing copy, whatever. And I always thought it would be really cool to make a living as a novelist. Why is it that it took me until I was 29 or 30 to make the extremely obvious connection between, well, you love novels, you're pretty good at writing. Have you ever thought about trying to write a novel and make a living that way instead of being a lawyer, which doesn't really agree with you? I don't know why such an obvious connection didn't hit me until I was that old, but that's how long it took. And that's when I started writing my first manuscript, which became the novel originally known as Rainfall, as you note, and now called Clean Kill in Tokyo.
Perfect. Yeah, I think though too. I mean, you got to admit it because I have heard from a few authors that, for instance, at one upon time were attorneys. It's a little bit of that leap of faith, especially when you've got a job that pays okay.
Yeah, yeah,
Not every author gets the big pocketbook.
yeah, yeah. I think anybody who has a steady paycheck, and what does that even mean? It's not so binary, but some paychecks are steadier than others.
Right.
Uh, Anyone who has that steady paycheck and responsibilities, I mean, family, a mortgage, or even if you're alone, I mean, it's still scary. I mean, how am I going to pay the rent and keep eating? The decision to go in for yourself is scary. It's uncertain, and yeah, I've had to make that decision twice actually. The first time was when finally got an agent who was taking the first manuscript out, and my wife Laura and I, who's now my literary agent now, um, she and I had this whole conversation about like if the agent can sell it, and if there's an advance, how big an advance does it need to be for me to feel confident? Okay, I could quit my job and we can live on the advance for long enough to see if I can make a go of this. We had that whole formula worked out. And it was in that first advance actually came from a Japanese publisher called Village Books, because that first book, A Clean Kill in Tokyo, it's right there in the title now, set in Tokyo, involves some Japanese things. My protagonist, John Rain, is a half Japanese, half American killer whose specialty is making it look like natural causes. So there are all these Japan elements. And my agent at the time cleverly said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to sell it. We're going to try to sell it in Japan first. And if we can do it, that's unusual enough so that we'll then get some attention in the States. Maybe PW will write an article about this unusual approach, which they did. And then all the US publishers will be interested. And it did work out exactly as he foretold. So anyway, we had to make the decision about, is this advance big enough? And it was, but it was still quite scary to give up that regular paycheck and do this highly uncertain thing. But for anybody who might be facing a similar decision, not just with regard to writing full time, but anything. You want to open a restaurant, or if you're a lawyer and you're thinking I might leave the firm and hang up my own shingle, whatever it is, I think this is one thing to consider. There's no right decision for everyone. Obviously, it depends on all sorts of factors and how you weigh them. But your chances of making a go of it are improved if you give it your all. And that's scary because it means, okay, you're gonna cut the cords. But my analogy at the time was, if you're trying to kick a door open, you don't want to be kicking it gently. You don't want to be holding back because you're tied to some other thing. You want to really just blast that door with everything you've got. And I thought, if I'm going to make a go of this, it means I need to get to work right away and on the next book. And how am I going to do that if certainly won't be able to do it as effectively if I have a busy day job. So that was part of the calculus. Like, I don't want to look back and say, well, I tried, but I was also doing this other thing and it didn't work out. I thought, if I fail, I will fail mightily. I'm glad to say it. That was 25 years ago. I haven't failed yet. Anyway, and uh, and then the other big decision was whether to leave traditional publishing and self-publish my book, The Detachment. That was another big decision because at that point I was well established. I'd written, I think, 10 books or something like that, 9 books. And am I really going to leave that system that's working well for me and self-publish this book? Same kind of calculus. I'm not a numbers guy at all, practically enumerate, but I did at the time. This is, I think, 2011. I did run the numbers and say, what are my digital sales were exploding, my paper sales were shrinking. The only thing you really need a traditional publisher for is paper. Even that you don't need, but brick and mortar distribution of paper, you do need a traditional publisher. And I just thought, these guys charge me a premium on everything, including digital, but I don't need them for digital. Digital I can do on my own and keep 4 times as much per unit. Ran the numbers and I just thought, financially, it just doesn't make sense for me to stay in the system anymore. Not the way my sales are breaking down across digital and paper. So, but it was a scary decision again. And it wound up being obviated because Amazon Publishing, which was new at the time, heard about the decision that I'd made to self-publish. It got some press because the soundbite was, New York Times bestselling author makes this decision. Anyway, Amazon Publishing got in touch and they said, hey, Barry, we read about your decision. We think it's super interesting. Would you be interested in talking about a way where you can get all the flexibility and time to market and all the other things you say and control over various business decisions that you say you want from self-publishing while also having the Amazon marketing machine behind you? Of course, my response to that was hell yes. There were some indie publishers, self-published authors who were a little miffed at the time about my decision. And I tried to point out that how I publish, to me, it's not an ideology. It's a business I'm running.
Mhm.
So I'm just trying to make the best business decision. I don't have anything against, not really, traditional publishing. I mean, a little bit, but only in the sense that I have anything against all forms of concentrated capital that naturally, organically, inevitably wind up exploiting labor. That's just what concentrated capital does. It's not like traditional publishing is uniquely evil, any more so than corporate management or Hollywood distributors, studios, networks, that sort of thing. It's just the way it works. Anyway, in the end, I'm just trying to make the best business decision. So that was probably a longer answer to your question than you had.
No, no, that's you know what? As an interviewer, we love long answers.
I have to
As
figure out the next question.
well, no, as
Oh,
one
you're
one
gonna
of my
love me. I just have my coffee too.
one of my early viewers pointed out one time when I first started doing this, I was doing chats more than interviews.
Yeah.
And after it was over, they're like, we were really hoping for more Martha and less Gryftkin. So I'm fine now with just asking the questions because that's what
All
people
right.
want.
I'll try
They
to.
want to see your answer, not me.
I always do try to abbreviate my answers, believe it or not, despite consistently failing spectacularly. But I will say this: I try to make my answers useful to anybody who's doing anything, even just being alive. I mean, I've now lived long enough to have learned a few things the hard way that I wish I'd known when I was younger. So if those things come up in an interview, then I'm always thinking, all right, somebody can use this information maybe in a way so that so I would love it if people could make their own special mistakes instead of having to repeat mistakes other people have made. None of us is ever quite that lucky, but still, uh, I find it pays to listen to people who've been up ahead of you on the trail and can report on conditions. That's what I try to do.
Yeah, it definitely helps. So, a couple of questions I like to ask just for aspiring authors out there. First one, what does a day, when it comes to writing, what does a day in the life of Barry Eisler look like?
So this is another. I'll frame this in that way where I'm always trying to make things useful. Some of the best advice I've ever heard comes from Bruce Lee, which is absorb what is useful, discard what is not useful, make it uniquely your own. I don't I don't think there's any way to avoid that advice. I actually once gave some writing advice to someone who I would describe as a kind of no but rather than yes and person. And she immediately started saying, yeah, and trying to find the things that were wrong with it. And I said, see, you're doing what Bruce Lee told you to do. right? You're absorbing the aspects that are useful, and you can't get away from it. You can't really criticize that advice. If you do, you're still following it. So if you're an aspiring writer, and you want to know what a writer who's a little farther up the trail than you've yet traveled would advise, just remember the way that writer who's advising you does it is not necessarily something you should do. It's just an example of something that can work, and it might work for you. But absorb what is useful, discard what is not useful, make it uniquely your own. By the way, some of the best advice I've ever received comes allegedly, at least, from Winston Churchill. I think a lot of things get attributed to people like Winston Churchill that maybe they didn't really say, but the advice I've heard attributed to him is, when you find yourself going through hell, keep going. That's very good advice. Anyway, my days vary a lot. I would just say this in general. I do a lot of prep time. I think a lot about the characters. To me, that's the most important thing I need to know. Who are these people really as complete three-dimensional human beings? The other thing I try to do with whatever it is I talk about in these interviews is I try to give, to the extent I'm giving advice, I want it to be useful. And what does useful mean? I think to me, it means actionable. You got to be able to do something with it. Otherwise, it's just aspirational. There's nothing wrong with aspirations, but you can't really do anything with them directly. So when I say I need to know my characters, I think it's good advice that you really do want to know your characters. Your character's behavior ultimately is what's going to drive the plot. The way they react to events based on who they are, that's going to drive the plot. Otherwise, you might not be writing the best story you can write. There may be exceptions. I don't know. Maybe action stories are the least character driven that I know of, and they can work because if the action's great, then okay, great. But you really need to know your characters. And what does that mean? For me, it means knowing what they want consciously, what they think they want, but also what do they really want. In other words, what do they want, but what do they need? I've heard this expressed a lot of different ways in a lot of different how-to books and videos. You can think of it as, is there a lie the character is telling herself or himself, and that's governing the way she or he lives? I'm going to say the way these characters live their lives. And if there is, what would be the truth that would, in a sense, correct course, set them free? And I'll just give you a quick example of this from a movie I love. I think it's one of the best movies ever. And I'm not saying it just because it's in black and white. I don't want to sound precious. It's Casablanca. It's just a perfect movie. And there are a lot of lessons you can learn from it about what is the absolute pinnacle of great writing. I'm really not saying this just because the movie's over 80 years old. I actually think Citizen Kane is boring, even though people, at least they profess to revere it. I don't know if they actually do, or if they're just trying to be precious. I know Orson Welles invented a lot of the grammar of modern filmmaking, and nothing but respect for that. But the movie itself is dull. Anyway, if you think about Rick Blaine, Humphrey Bogart's character in the movie, if you ask him, what do you want? He would say, I just want to run a saloon and I stick my neck out for no one. He says these things in the movie. I'm the only cause I'm fighting for now. He has decided that the proper way to live your life is not to engage with anything, not to make yourself vulnerable, not to stick your neck out. But does he really need that? Or is that actually shriveling him and ruining that philosophy, ruining him as a human? It's actually ruining him. And then there's an inciting incident, which is Ilsa comes back into his life, Ingrid Bergman. And over the course of the story, he has to make a decision, like he has to abandon a lie and re-engage in the fight to become a complete human being. That would be a great example in my mind of what's the lie a person's telling himself and what's the truth that he needs to embrace that'll set him free. And to get to those questions, even, you really need to know a lot of things, like what were the formative experiences this character had? Like, first, what does he want? What does he think he wants? What were the formative experiences? Some people say, like, oh, I ask what music my character listens to or what she has in her closet or on her bookshelf. If those questions work for you, then in accordance with Bruce Lee's dictum, God bless. I don't usually ask those questions too much. I think those are more peripheral. It's not bad to know those things. I just think of them more as peripheral things, not core things. The core things are the formative experiences. What does the character want? What does the character think he wants? Or what does she really want? What does she really need? Those are things you want to get in touch with. And to do that, you got to think a lot about the characters. So I take a lot of walks I find I can't really think effectively about these things if I'm not moving around. If I'm not at least pacing in my office, but my office isn't very big, so it's not efficient to keep pacing in it. Uh, but that's just how I do it. I'm pretty sure it was Tess Gerritsen. Tess, I apologize if I'm misremembering, but I seem to remember Tess Gerritsen, author Tess Gerritsen, once telling me that she did her deep thinking lying down on her couch. That does not work for me. I'll fall asleep for sure. But if it works for you, then that's what you should be doing. No one will grade you on your process. Your process is just should be reverse engineered for what is maximally efficient and effective at making you write the best stories you can write. So that's it. That's what I do a lot of, especially at the outset. A lot of walks, a lot of thinking, talking to my dictaphone, write up those notes when I come home, talk to my wife like I was this morning, my literary agent, my collaborator, figure stuff out. She gets impatient. She's like, "Have you started writing yet?" And she knows this to be true, even though because she's my agent, she wants to see those words on the page. Um, I think of the questions I ask about the characters and of course about the plot. You can't really completely pull these things apart as the foundation. I'm digging a hole. I'm laying the foundation. I got to pour concrete. I got to do a lot of stuff. There's not a lot to show for it. It's happening underground. I think the mistake a lot of writers make is the foundation is ill prepared and they start putting up walls. Those walls will fall down if the foundation isn't sound. Or they'll lean, they won't look good. They just won't be sound. Make sure the foundation is right before you start putting up those walls, and the project will go much faster and more efficiently from there, and it will all come together much better. You'll spend a lot less time fixing things, and you'll be able to get things right the first time better if you spend more time with the foundation. So all those questions I ask myself, mostly about the character, but of course also about the plot and the reason why am I even writing this book? Why does it matter? Why am I interested in this? One more little bit of advice, consistent with my overlong answers, is this. Um, it has been my observation that when it comes to writing, people have a tendency to get in their own way. I think it would be an exaggeration to say, oh, everybody's a born storyteller. There's an expression like every journalist has a novel in him, and that's where it should stay. I don't know about that. I mean, I can name some journalists who also have written some terrific novels, um, but I think people get in their own way in the following sense. A lot of people do know generally how to tell a story. Everybody understands the concept of beginning, middle, and end. If you ask someone, if someone had a funny anecdote from some time in their life, a thing that happened, they would, even if they're not a great raconteur, they would naturally have a sense. You don't start in the middle of it, not naturally, not organically. You tell the story in a way so that people can understand it. But when it comes to, okay, now I'm going to write the story, it's amazing how people are like, well, now I am writing the story and I must do some fancy things. And when I teach writing, I taught a semester of technology licensing ages ago at Santa Clara Law School. My approach is always the same. Stop thinking about, oh, I'm writing a contract. Stop thinking, oh, I'm writing an essay or even a novel. Pretend you're just talking to a friend who's really interested that you want to write this thing. If it's a contract, you're coming home from work and your spouse says, "Oh, honey, how was your day?" And you say, "Oh, it was great. I worked on this really interesting contract." And your spouse says, "Oh, what was it? What kind of contract?" Don't think it. Just say, "Well, it was between Matsushita and Microsoft." And I once spent 2 years as in-house counsel at Matsushita Panasonic in Japan. So that's my example. Anyway, oh, and it was really interesting. Matsushita has this DVD codec, and Microsoft's thinking about incorporating it in their Windows operating system. And to do that, they'd have to develop some things together. And then if it all goes well, blah blah, they'd pay them this, and there'd be a development period. This is just the order of the relationship. And you're just telling it in the way that makes sense. But when people write a contract, they're like, I don't know, the indemnities are important. I'm like, no, the indemnities, that's not specific to this relationship. Whatever. Essays, the same thing. I used to do this with my daughter Emma when she was learning how to write in high school. She'd have a little trouble with structure, as people do. And I'd say, forget about the essay. Just tell me, why are you interested in this topic? Forget about it. Just tell me, like, we're just friends. You're like, I decided to write about this thing because. It's amazing how the structure flows from that. So this is another thing I try to do when I'm thinking about a story. Why do I even care? Who is this person? Why do I care about John Rain, about this dilemma he's facing, or just about his life? Why is he interesting to me? Talk about this stuff. Don't worry about the book. Just talk about it. Spend time with these people. Get to feel them. That's what it has to be, I think, in the end. You want to feel the characters. I don't want to sound precious about this. I sometimes look, if people really feel this way, it's great. I always feel it sounds a little precious, like my writers actually, my characters speak to me. I'm like, that, okay. I mean, I have characters who I don't have to think very hard when I'm writing their dialogue. It does seem like they're just reacting and just saying the things that they would naturally say. There's a ton of foundational work that goes into that to get to the point where you feel your characters so much that you've somewhat faded into the background and your characters are on the page just doing what they do. Um, uh, all the foundational work I try to do is getting to the point where I feel my characters that way, asking all those questions about the formative experiences and the worldview and the hopes and the fears. What do they think they want? What do they really want? All those things. And then I start writing. And then there's a ratio. I write some, and then I got to think a little more, take some more walks, and then I can write some more as I figure it out. For me, the process is kind of like you're driving your car down a dark road and the headlights only illuminate so far ahead of you. And to see more, you got to keep driving. That's a good analogy for me. Feels right for me. And then as the story goes along, the ratio changes and there's less thinking and more writing until the last 10% or so. There's very little thinking and it's really just trying to keep up with the story and much more just typing to keep up with what I've already figured out. And that's just unfolding naturally on the page. And that is a very special experience. It's beautiful. You work hard for that last 10% when you're just in that flow state and it's all just happening. So again, I don't want to be precious, but a little bit dancer becoming the dance. It's a little precious. I'm just sitting there really, caffeinated. But the effort is gone. It sometimes feels like you've been hacking your way through the jungle with a machete, slow going, a lot of work. And then all the underbrush, all the stuff you're having to hack is getting thinner and thinner. And then finally it's just clear. You're just running clear of all this stuff as fast as you can run. It's a really satisfying feeling because it can only happen in my experience with a lot of foundational work, a lot of struggling at the keyboard. I know I hear a lot of writers say like, "Oh, I have to write," or I'll go crazy. Or I'm like, "Oh, it must be great, man." It doesn't really. For me, I really gotta glue myself to the seat. It's hard work.
No, and part of the reason I ask that question, and I ask it of every author, is because I want aspiring authors to look like kind of like what you pointed out. Use what works for you.
Hmm.
I want them to see that there's no one right way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Uh,
important.
you did say your wife is also your literary agent. Doesn't that make it a little hard to duck your agent when you're behind on deadline?
It makes it impossible. Um, yeah, Laura, she got into this business at about the same time I did. It's funny, people assume that we met in the business, which is a safe assumption, but we actually met in college and we got married young. I can't believe how young. I was 25 and she was 24, which is completely crazy. Um, I mean, you're making the biggest decision of your life when your brain's probably not even fully formed, but seems to have worked out. Something just popped into my head, which is I don't know if anybody remembers, but Ted Koppel used to be an ABC news personality back in the day. He used to do the presidential debates, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, you would remember him. And Ted Koppel was Jewish, and he married a Catholic woman. And Ted Koppel's mother was very much opposed to the wedding. I heard Ted Koppel talking about this. So they got married anyway. And on his 25th wedding anniversary, Ted Koppel said to his mother, "So, Ma, I guess you were wrong about the marriage." She says, "Only time will tell."
Sounds about right.
So anyway, so Laura and I met in college. Started dating in college, and she got into this business at about the same time I did. And she started with children's books. So at the time, she was new. She didn't know editors on the adult side, the thriller side. And I've been working on my novel for a while. This is like in 2001. When I found my first agent was earlier than that because I worked hard on that manuscript, many revisions between when this guy Nat Sobel first decided to take me on and when he judged correctly that the manuscript was finally ready to take out. That was years. Anyway, Laura wouldn't have been the right agent for me back then. But fast forward to 2011, she was doing a lot of adult fiction, including thrillers. And we just decided uh, Nat and I had parted ways, and then I had another agent after Nat and I parted ways, who was also really good. They're both terrific agents, but I was making some business decisions having to do with self-publishing and Amazon publishing, that sort of thing. That those guys just looked at things differently than I did. And so when it was time to part ways, the second time, Laura and I talked about like, you know, can you really represent me? Can you be a buffer the way you want your business representative to be? Because or is it like you're going to get tough with the publisher and they're not going to feel like it's going to just back up onto me because you're just Barry's wife. We might as well be hearing this you're angry about the marketing plan. You might as well be Barry telling us directly, and then they get irritated at me in return. We just decided all that stuff could be managed, and it was definitely, I think I could say, unless I'm overlooking something, best business decision I've ever made. Uh, so now Laura represents me on everything, including the film and television stuff. And I had before Laura three, I think three or four, I forget, film and television agents. One of them was good. The others, I'll just say they weren't right for me. Uh, in keeping with Bruce Lee's dictum. I mean, I have friends
Mhm.
who work with these people, and it's a good relationship, but they were not delivering to me what I expect a representative to deliver. Laura is absolutely by far the best. I'm not saying that because she's my wife. She's just stellar. So that has been a really great, super productive business relationship. I mean, she's been collaborating with me all the way back to the first book, but it's just gotten more extensive since then, and it's really satisfying. Uh, because I don't tell anyone was late this morning, and that's because Laura and I were sitting. I screwed up the dates, but then Laura and I were sitting in the kitchen. She's having her tea. I'm having my coffee, and we're just figuring out stuff for the book I'm working on now. We get to do that every morning. I mean, she can't always. She does have other clients,
Yeah.
but she does indulge me. So yeah, it's just been it's been a really fun and interesting relationship. And I'll say one more thing about it because this might be useful to anybody who who's your agent, who you collaborate with. It's a thing Laura and I didn't realize for a long time. We had these there's sometimes a lot of friction in our collaborative conversations where we get frustrated with each other in a positive way. I mean, it's not like we're screaming or throwing pots and pans or anything, but it's like, why can't you understand this thing I'm saying? And at some point I realized we have a different default approach to figuring out story stuff, which I summarize as the air game and the ground game. And I think this is true of a lot of people. So just keep this in mind as you're collaborating. You might see this. It won't necessarily stop the friction, but it's interesting to realize where it's coming from.
Mhm.
Laura's an air game person. She sees things much more clearly than I do from 30,000 feet up. She sees where the story's going, the trajectory of the story, and that excites her, and that's the main thing for her. But I'm much more a ground game guy. I'm on the terrain, I'm hiking along, and there are rivers and mountains and obstacles, and those things need to be managed, and they should be managed. I mean, those obstacles, without obstacles, there's no story. So that's good stuff, but it takes a lot of thinking to figure out how it's going to be integrated into the story. Anyway, so I'll be talking in my plodding way about, okay, we got this and this and this. And Laura's like, yeah, of course, those things. And then and then the thing happens at the midpoint, and then, and the resolution. And I'm like, and it makes me uncomfortable. And I'm like, that's so good. But between here and there, there's this other stuff. And at some point I realized we're almost talking about a different element of the story. You have to have some, as you're writing, you're going to have some grasp of both. It'll shift around. Different people will emphasize one or the other as in their approach. It doesn't matter. But the point is, Laura's default is much more air game, and mine is much more plotting ground game. And that was producing a lot of the friction. It's funny that recognizing this has really done almost nothing to alleviate the friction. It's not bad friction. It's actually very positive in its results. But it was also interesting for me to realize this is why we're always having this. It's always the same thing. She sees the thing more clearly. And I don't want to talk about that. It's making me nervous because I'm still trying to figure out the stuff that's right in front of my nose, my feet, whatever.
No, no. Trust me. Anybody with a spouse knows that. Yeah, you see things from different angles, and sometimes you're using the exact same words as the other person, but they mean two completely different things. So that
Yes,
is all good.
yes, it's true. You got to learn to speak each other's love languages. It's important.
Exactly. So getting on to the system, because that is your latest book. One of the first questions I was going to have while I was reading it, and then I got to the after part of the book, and I'm like, oh, he's pretty much answered all this. I was going to ask how much research you put into this. And you've got a list of books and links that inspired that, that is probably a good 10, 12 pages all by itself.
Yeah. So the system is for now a standalone. And I say for now because my first book is a John Rain book. I already told you who he is, the half American, half Japanese assassin whose specialty is natural causes. And then the first non-Rain book I wrote was about a guy named Ben Trevin with another character named Daniel Larison. And that was going to be a standalone, but then those guys wound up crossing into Rain's universe. And then there was Livia Lone, my Seattle sex crimes detective, who's not just investigating sex crimes, but she's punishing them on her own time. And then Livia wound up crossing with Rain and these characters. So you could think of it a little bit like the Marvel Cinematic Universe or Marvel Comics universe, but with assassins and rogue cops and black ops soldiers and that sort of thing. So the system is definitely a standalone for now, but who can say what the future holds? Protagonist is Valeria Velez, who at the beginning of the book has just been elected to Congress. She's maybe 30 years old, very young. She's going to represent California's 27th district, and she's an idealist. And this idealist is about to encounter the way power really works in America. That's the story, and all the dilemmas that she's going to face, which are going to act on aspects of her character that are themselves the result of genes and experience that she's had in the world. And so you can see why I take a lot of walks thinking about who is Valeria? Where did she come from? What were her formative experiences? How are the events of this book going to interact with who she is innately as a human to drive the story? And so there was a lot of research in one sense in the system because it's set in a milieu that's different, some overlap, but different than my previous books. This book is set in the halls of power in America. That means inside the Pentagon, inside Congress, inside Silicon Valley. I have some experience in these places. I mean, I live in Silicon Valley. I was a Silicon Valley lawyer and then a technology executive for a while back in the day. I've actually never been to the Pentagon. I've really never set foot in it. I wanted to do a tour for this book, and it's the timing on getting out to the DC area didn't work out. But Google to the rescue, you know, there are lots of photos, that sort of thing. And I did work inside that. I spent 3 years in a covert position in the CIA, so that's a decent analogs. And I was actually an intern for New Jersey Senator Frank. Oh my God, I can't remember his name. It was so long ago. Lautner, maybe Lautenberg, something like that. My first after my first year of law school. Anyway, the research is more just obsessions of mine. I read a lot, think a lot, and I write a fair amount. If anyone's curious, I have a Substack blog called Heart of the Matter, where I'm extremely interested in human nature. I think you better be if you want to be a novelist, and particularly in the way human nature manifests itself in systems of power, including the American system. That interest alone is going to branch out into things like media, propaganda, all this tribal issues, all these sorts of things. So I spend more time than I probably should reading this stuff, listening to podcasts, writing about this stuff, obsessing about it, talking about it with Laura, and she listens because she knows that's my love language. So that's good of her. And what happens when you're really interested, when you're passionate about something, and if you indulge those passions, what happens in my experience is those indulged passions will start to make their way into the way you think about stories. It's not a coincidence, for example, that my first manuscript is about a half Japanese guy. He's a judo expert living in Japan. He spends a lot of time in jazz clubs and whiskey bars, bespoke coffee houses, that sort of thing. He's an expert on surveillance and counter surveillance. Now, I had all these experiences. I'm no kind of expert. Rain is another level, but I actually was trained in surveillance and counter surveillance and other tradecraft when I was at the CIA. I was living in Tokyo when I started the manuscript for that book. Absolutely intoxicated by that city. It's my favorite city in the world. I'll never stop loving it, being fascinated by it and all its mysteries. Um, and Laura and I, when we were living there for the first time in 1993, we made friends with some Japanese people who were taking us to the whiskey bars and the jazz clubs and the coffee houses and that kind of stuff. I was training in judo at the Kodokan. I did get my first degree black belt during that first year, which is where I topped out in judo. So I know enough about judo, I like to think anyway, to write about it convincingly. Could I do it the way Rain does for real? No, of course not. Very few people could. He's the real deal. But anyway, all this stuff that I was so gaga about went into the book. And more recently with the system, these are topics I've been thinking about a lot, about how power is really exercised in America. And this system, we're constantly told, involves our sacred democracy, and all of us were just inculcated. I actually would use the word propagandized. But a lot of Americans think we're not propagandized, and I don't want to produce an immediate defensive reaction. I try to introduce ideas in a way that will lead to the most productive conversations possible. And to do that, you got to be careful about touching tribal buttons or deeply held belief buttons. Otherwise, you just get a defensive reaction. And now you're just arguing. You're not really getting any closer to the truth. But I would say that Americans are heavily propagandized. Part of the basis for the effectiveness of American propaganda is that we're taught that we're not propagandized. So we really don't have any defenses against it. In the Soviet Union, where the state newspaper was actually called Pravda, truth, those people at least knew they were being propagandized, and that in itself is a bit of a defense. Friends with a self-defense guru, writer and lecturer, an all-around fascinating guy named Mark MacYoung, Mark Animal MacYoung. Mark has a saying that I found to be true, which is, when you recognize something is dangerous, it automatically becomes less dangerous. And if you think about that, it's true. It doesn't mean it's not at all dangerous, but when you recognize it's dangerous, you can immediately take some steps. Like if it's a rattlesnake and you recognize it's a rattlesnake, yeah, it's still dangerous, but you don't have to walk right over it or whatever. I mean, now and you deal with it in a new way that makes it less dangerous to you. So I think propaganda is the same thing. If you don't think you're propagandized, it's going to be a challenge for you. Once you recognize you're being propagandized, there's hope. So these are things I think about a lot and have formed my opinion that to understand the way policy is made in America, you have to understand where power really lies. And where it really lies is, sure, in money, but in different factions. They're all jockeying for positions within an overall system. And those factions are things like the military industrial complex. That would be the Pentagon and arms manufacturers. Sorry, the defense industry. We have to call it, it's all about defense. We have to defend
The War
ourselves.
Department.
Say it again. So the war. Yeah, even war, I think, is the wrong name. It's not a neutral term would be the military department. I think that would be a neutral descriptive term. I mean, Defense Department is pure propaganda. To name like the purpose, like really, this is all about defense. We spend $1 trillion. What are we defending ourselves against? We have oceans on either side, basically friendly neighbors up and down. Who needs $1 trillion? 10 times more than the next country spends on its military to defend ourselves against one. It's propaganda. At least it's arguable. War, we're not, well, we are always at war, but not everything the Pentagon does is about war. So military, why not call it military? At least if you're a journalist, I say this all the time. Why are you always talking about defense spending? It's propaganda. You're just adopting the government's preferred nomenclature. We know it's the government's preferred nomenclature. They changed the name of the War Department in 1947 to the Defense Department. Why did the government do that? Call it military spending. That is accurate and neutral. Anyway, see, don't get me started on this stuff. We're not.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I feel like I'm talking to Monty right now.
Monty, Monty Cranston. It's funny. I got a friend named Monty who advises me, a former air marshal who advises me on the firearms aspects of the book. And I was like, do you know Monty? It's funny. Yeah, Monty Cranston's a little bit my Greek chorus. He's an interesting guy. He's on the spectrum. And the way I would sum up Monty is he has enormous insight into human nature, and he's completely occluded to individual humans. Really interesting guy. Anyway, so these are just things I think about a lot. I think so we're talking about the military. Where is power in America? Military industrial complex, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, corporations generally. the energy industry. I mean, there's overlap in what I'm describing here, but to the extent you want to carve out different fiefdoms, this is the way I would generally carve them out. And and then there's the political system that actually serves these power centers. Now, we all do in America have the right to vote. That's true, but people get distracted by this. And what they don't see is that the game these politicians are playing is this. What do I need to say to the voters who in the end, if I want to be elected, I need to get a certain number of votes. So I have to say certain things that, and maybe even deliver enough substantively to voters so that they'll vote for me. But those things are going to be just enough and have enough wiggle room, and the delivery of substantive things will be minimal enough to get the votes, while I'm also satisfying the needs and desires of where power and money actually resides in this country. That's the game. I don't even think this is arguable, but I'm always willing to discuss it in good faith with anyone who doesn't see it this way. Anyway, that's the way I see America, and it was an interesting challenge for me to set a story within this system that I think and talk about and write about so much. Uh, I don't think I was ready to do this as a craftsperson earlier in my career. I think earlier in my career, and don't get me wrong, I think my previous books are freaking awesome. I love them. I'm proud of them. Reactions are good. I've hit bestseller lists and lots of best of awards and that kind of thing. And I love those books. I mean, they make me laugh. They make me cry. I love those books. But it's also true to say that my previous books have a certain centrality of action in them, so that my brand is about, I think it's fair to say, several different things, but one of them is really great action scenes. I hope it doesn't sound like I'm bragging. I mean, if I weren't good at this stuff, I probably couldn't make a living doing it. And I suck at innumerable things, but I'm a pretty good writer and I work hard at the craft. Um, Action is part of what drives the stories. Character for sure, but there's this centrality of action in the previous books. There's less action in the system of the kind that you find in the previous books. There's definitely some. I sometimes joke that it's got all the sex and half the killing, but it's just not as action driven. And I don't know that I just didn't, I think, have the confidence until relatively later in my career, meaning now or whatever, the last couple of years, um, to rely enough on what's internal to the characters to make you care about the stakes of the book enough so that you're on the edge of your seat, even though, at least in this scene, it's not a life and death thing where we're engaged about. It's a personal thing. It's could be some kind of devastating career outcome or a devastating personal family outcome, something like that. Nobody's going to die. Nobody's going to go to prison necessarily, but still, you really feel the stakes acutely. And if you think about it, to do that, we come all the way back to character and those long walks and the foundational work that I think you have to do if you want to write great stories. And I think about great. I mean, just for this just popped into my head. Ask me tomorrow, I'll give you a different example. But uh, I think Richard Russo is a really a terrific novelist. It's funny, the reason my unconscious, I think, served up the word traditional there is he's a longtime defender of the traditional publishing system. I personally think he's not a clear thinker on this. Sorry, Richard. In the extremely unlikely event that you're listening to this, I mean no disrespect. You are in the first rank of storytellers, in my experience. Just absolutely beautiful, heartrending, gorgeous, real stories and characters that stay with you long after you've left the page. But as a thinker, about the system that has benefited him for so many decades, I think he's occluded. And that relates to this human nature stuff that fascinates me so much. And I know I'm going off on a tangent, but I'm going to just mention it very quickly. Richard Russo once wrote an article, I think it was in the New York Times, pretty sure, could be wrong, because it was a lot of years ago, 10 years ago, during the culture wars in publishing, where digital self-publishing had become a new thing, and a lot of people felt threatened by it and all that kind of stuff. And Russo wrote this op-ed and he said, hey, my daughter works in a bookstore and she once called me up and she said, Dad, do you know what this stuff windowing is? It's the practice of, and he didn't know. She said, it's the practice of people come into my bookstore and then they look what's in the store and then they open up the Amazon app, see what it's selling for an app, and they order the book from Amazon. That's killing our sales. Legitimate concern. Absolutely. And he said, well, I wanted to learn more about this. I hadn't really thought about it much. So I called or maybe sent an email, whatever, to Stephen King. I'm forgetting who the other authors were, but you get the idea. It was like Stephen King, maybe James Patterson, David Baldacci. I might be getting the names wrong, but I promise they were
Right.
absolute best-selling, among the most successful writers, most successful in the traditional system, which I sometimes call the legacy system, meaning a system that can still work but is not as efficient as certain other newer systems that have come along. And I thought, how can you not see that your methodology immediately coming out of the gate, it's flawed? You're trying to determine if the system has worked by asking the people who benefited most from it and only those people. That's like Jeff Bezos hearing about a new provision in the tax code and saying, I was curious about how this provision might work and how it might affect the country. So I called up Michael Dell and Warren Buffett and Elon Musk and said, guys, what do you think of this new provision in the tax code? We're all occluded by ego, but you got to make an effort to step outside it. So Richard Russo, again, in the unlikely event that you are listening to this, with great respect, I disagree with your methodology. You're doing what humans do, which is our ego narrows the aperture and we make mistakes. But as a storyteller, the stakes in his books, you could argue they're nothing. Nobody's going to die. There's no suitcase nuke under Los Angeles. There's nothing like this. But the characters are so real and gorgeously rendered. You care so much about them that they'll stay with you forever. Larry McMurtry is another one like that. You think about Lonesome Dove. Again, there's no suitcase nukes. There's no war going on. I mean, it's still skirmishes maybe between Native Americans and Westerners, but that book, for me personally, I've never read a book, the characters of which just live with me decades later after reading it. So you really got to know your characters, and to write that kind of book, the characters are carrying the whole thing. And I don't know that I felt sufficiently confident earlier in my career to try something like that. And the system is more that kind of book. There's a bit of a marketing challenge to let people know that, look, if you're expecting the action, the story to kick off with a kind of inciting incident, like of a killing gone awry or something like that, not that kind of book. There is killing, not as much. Anyway, so that's where the system came from. And as I do in all my books, as you note, unusually, I think among novelists, I have some pretty extensive notes in the back, author notes, bibliography, that kind of thing, because all my books are based on, to the extent I'm able, reality, real events, real places, that kind of stuff. And it's become part of my brand, which I think is cool. But I also just want people to know, hey, if I'm here to entertain you. It is, in fact, a novel. And so you should turn the pages as fast as you can, stay up too late, go to work tired the next morning, talk about it at the water cooler, tell everyone, oh my God, you got to read this book. That's the kind of book I want to write. But just because it's delicious doesn't mean it can't be nutritious. And in addition to illuminating, I hope, certain aspects of the human experience, I want people to know this stuff. Like my book, The God's Eye View, there's some way out surveillance apparatus in that book, some way out surveillance technology and depicted in the story. And I want people to know, hey, if you think I'm just making this stuff up, here are all sorts of links. Take a look for yourself. I'm just writing about reality and maybe a year, 5 years ahead of where reality is going. So I want to support all that. And that's become a bigger deal for me over time. If you go back to my first book, you'll see a few notes. It's been so long. I'm pretty sure there are just a few notes in A Clean Kill in Tokyo, but you'll see the progression. And by the time we get to the system, it's almost like I'm a historian documenting all my sources. But the beauty of it is nobody has to read that stuff. I think of it as just supplemental material for people who are interested. And which is
Author's note.
And there's no
Kill in
bibliography.
Tokyo. No, just one note. There's only one note.
Is it about the fruit store I call Higashimura?
Fruit store,
I think
midway
it's
up,
actually Nishimura fruit store at the bottom.
Yeah. Yep. You had one note.
Yeah, because I changed, and so I wanted people to know, this is a real place, but I moved it a little bit at the bottom of Dogenzaka Street in Shibuya for plot purposes. But the real fruit store is called this, and you can find it wherever. Yeah, so I had that early impulse 25 years ago, and it's only grown since then. And people, I mean, not everybody likes it, but the beauty of it is if you don't like it, don't read it. It's just extra material at the end of the book. But a lot of people seem to like it, and that's really gratifying for me because those notes take some effort. I do them as
Yeah.
I go. I wouldn't want to have to write them up when the book is done. But yeah, there's a certain amount of effort that goes into those notes. And by the way, for anyone who's curious, you can find excerpts, I think, of, if not all the books, then most of them on my website, barryeisler.com. And I put all the author notes on the website too. So, because I don't like in the audio books, I don't read the author notes. I mean, my God,
Oh,
it wouldn't just put you to sleep; it would put you in a coma. It just has to. Although I do.
HTTPS.
Sorry, what? Say it again.
I was just joking about like with author's notes. HTTPS
Yeah,
colon slash
exactly.
slash.
Can you imagine? It would be absolute torture. Although I do try to make the intro to the URLs sound, not just sound, like actually be engaging and connect with the book. But you can find them on my website. And then if you're listening to the audiobooks, which I narrate myself, then and you're curious, you can just go to my website and get all the links there. Anyway, so that's why all the notes. I want people to know what's real in the books, and what's real is a lot. Fictional characters in non-fictional settings is how I would describe it.
Well, I'm glad you said that too, because I was about to say, this is one of the first time you'll never hear me say this, that I'd wished I'd had the ebook instead of the physical book, because there's
So
so
you can
many
just,
URLs in the back. And I'm like, I just want to be
yeah.
able to click on these. I
It
don't want
is
to
an
type all that.
inherent limitation of paper, and I'm not trying to put paper down. I actually prefer to read books in paper, but it is true that if there's a word you don't know and you want to look it up, or a link you want to click on, it's more laborious with paper than with digital.
Getting back to something you mentioned in there too when you were talking about this, uh, I was definitely thinking about the fact that, and I won't spoil anything, but if this had been a Doc's story,
Yeah,
the flower delivery scene would have gone completely differently than it was for Valeria.
that's very fair.
But
Uh,
no, I appreciated that. As again, for me, and I'll be honest with you, the only thing I took away from this book that would draw it down anything is the fact that John Rain and those guys weren't in it, because I just love those guys.
Thank you.
But the story held its own without having to have the over the top action.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And that does seem to be the consensus. It's gratifying. I was a little nervous writing this one because, I mean, every time if you're a writer and you develop a brand, doing something new, it's like, are they going to like this? Will people follow me in this direction? I mean, in some ways, the best example of this I can think of is Stephen King. Uh, he was the king of horror. I started reading Stephen King when I was in 8th grade. First Stephen King book was The Shining. It had that silver reflective cover for anybody who remembers that far ago and that long ago. And he was the horror guy. And then at some point, his books started having less horror in them. And he actually was able to extend his brand. His brand really now is just,
Mhm.
I would say Stephen King's brand is master storyteller, who also writes horror when he wants to.
Yeah.
But it's challenging to extend the brand because there are people who they love horror and that's what they want. And if they think, oh, look, Stephen King, hey man, I love you when you're writing horror, but I'm going to skip your book it's just about some sort of drama among humans. I'm not going to read that. So he's done a great job with that. And anytime you do something, when I wrote my first non-Rain book, I wrote 6 Rain books. People loved John Rain, and the books were doing better and better. I think that 6th book was my first. Was it like a Wall Street Journal and a Washington? It might have been a New York Times bestseller. I don't remember. It was a pretty decent sized bestseller. And then suddenly I'm going to write a Ben Trevin, Daniel Larison book. A lot of people will guarantee they're going to be like, yeah, call me when when you write the next
Hmm.
Rain book. So I've done that a few times now, and now the system is even more different than what I've written before. But one more thing I'll say about Stephen King that I learned from him, I think it was in his book Dance Macabre, is one of 2 nonfiction books he's written. His other one is a terrific half how-to, half memoir called On Writing. Dance Macabre is an examination of horror. That was another one I read. I think I was in 8th grade when I read that book. I was pretty young. Anyway, I think if I remember correctly, it was in that book, and he said, I've never written a book for the money. That doesn't mean I've never returned a check. I'm not crazy. And
Yeah.
I share that attitude. I mean, I will never object to anyone paying me. I hope one day I make 100 times what I've made all along, or whatever. I'll never return those checks. But it's not my primary calculus. When I write a book, I want to feel passionate about it. It's hard enough writing a book when you're passionate about it. Writing something by the numbers, I wouldn't want to have to do that. So anyway, that's why I bounce around a little bit despite the inherent risk. And by the way, Stephen King, in the extremely unlikely event that, like Richard Russo, you happen to be listening to this interview, if I may, politically, I do see your posts on Twitter from time to time. And it's not that I disagree with your conclusions, although often I do. I would just say, watch out for the tribalism, which is a form of ego occlusion. And ask yourself this question. If you didn't know who was saying the thing that was said or doing the thing that was done or articulating the policy that was articulated, how would you feel about it then? That should be your guide. What I think it was the philosopher John Rawls called it the veil of ignorance. I think that's a bad name for what Rawls, if it was Rawls, was talking about. I think it should be called something like the golden veil or something like that, because it's actually a beautiful thing. It's the idea that I'm a disembodied consciousness and I'm going to be incarnated as something on earth. What do I want the rules to be? And that should be your guide to morality. You shouldn't be reverse engineering from how are things now, whether like who am I was born as a straight white male in New Jersey, or I was born as a cow, or I was born as a man or a woman or whatever. You don't know those things, so what should the rules be? Proceed from there. And I think as I see Stephen King's tweets, I sense a degree of tribalism that I think is occluding him in ways that are unfortunate, because this is a guy with as grand an imagination as God or nature has ever given anyone. But he's not accessing it when it comes to the political stuff. I say that with all respect. Someone who's been reading Stephen King's books for almost 50 years.
A slight aside, I always get a kick out of it when somebody says, like, I would never read King. And I'm like, "Do you ever watch Shawshank Redemption?"
Oh,
So many people have no idea that's his book or his
interesting.
story. They have no clue.
Oh my God, what a movie, and well, it's a long short story. Rita
Right.
Hayworth in Shawshank Redemption. Yeah, in different seasons. That one I read in high school. I forget exactly how old I was. See, I told you I've been reading these books for a long time. He is a master storyteller. Although I think, a thing that can happen, and again, the only self-defense I can think of is you gotta have a knack, or at least an inclination, for taking yourself outside yourself. Uh, his later books have gotten longer and not necessarily in service of the story. And I would argue that his editors are afraid to edit him, or feel they don't need to edit him because 3 million hardback sales is just baked in. Why bother? Um, and that's a thing to watch out for. At the highest level, you could call it sycophancy. I think, being a billionaire, I'm not even talking specifically about Stephen King here. Being a billionaire has a lot of advantages in this world, obviously, but it has a big
Rumor.
disadvantage. Yeah, right, it has was it like the rich are not like you, and the rich are different than you and me. They have more money, but it has a big disadvantage too, which is everybody's going to become a sycophant. I mean, who are you going to trust to
Yeah.
give you unbiased feedback? It becomes very difficult. Just surrounded by people who all they want to do is get in your good grace and flatter you. And I think that could probably happen to a writer or a novelist, a screenwriter, whoever, just outsized success. And then people be afraid to give you real feedback. In fact, for any fans of the Apple show, The Studio, which I loved, Seth Rogen's show, it's hilarious. It's about how movies are made. Uh, and it's just a little bit of a send up of Hollywood. It's really funny. And there's an episode with Ron Howard, who's hilariously playing he's playing himself, but Ron Howard is famously a nice guy. Everyone's like the nicest guy in Hollywood, and he's actually playing an asshole in the show, like a petty, vindictive, and it's hilarious. But he's made this movie that's fantastic, but then the last part of the movie gets tacked on, and it's awful. It's just nothing to do with the movie, and everyone's afraid to tell Ron Howard that this thing you've done at the end is awful. Just cut it, and it'll be a perfect movie. That I'm sure that is a danger, and it's probably a danger to certainly like someone who's as successful as Stephen King. If I ever become remotely that successful, I'll be on guard for that sort of danger. For now, it seems not to be too much of a problem.
All right. I'll remember not to blow any smoke your way. All right. That'll be perfect. Um, one other thing, and I'm definitely not going to spoil this one. You talked about the fact that this is a standalone at the moment. And the final chapter, to me, is what made this book go from, I'm kind of interested to see where this story goes after the book, to that also might be the perfect ending. You leave that in there about, okay, what's going to happen next? And sometimes I feel this especially happens in horror stories. You leave that up to the imagination of the reader,
Yeah.
and sometimes that's almost perfect.
Yeah.
So if you did a sequel, I would read it, but if
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
is a standalone, it's also great.
That was a really interesting question there. And what I tried to do, actually, what am I saying? I try to do this at the end of every book. Because the rain has gone from book to book to book, and every one of my books is I write it so that it will function perfectly as a standalone. You don't need to read any other of my books. You can start with any book you want. It's an individual unit. It is an individual standalone story. That said, there's also a progression in the books. You think of the Rain books, everything that happens to Rain in each book affects his character, his desires, his motivations, his worldview, everything, such that he's a different person as he interacts with the events, the plot of the next book, and on and on. By the way, my model for this was James Cameron. And if you're looking for writers to emulate, you can do a lot worse than James Cameron. He's best known, I think it's fair to say, as a top director, and he is. But I don't know that much about directing. If you ask me, was that movie well directed? It's just, I don't really speak that language that well. I can give you some ideas, but it's just not my thing. But I could tell you a lot about what makes great writing, in my opinion. Cameron is absolutely a superb writer. There's nobody better. There really isn't. And when it came time for me to write my second book, which then Penguin Putnam, which had bought the first book in a 2-book deal, they wanted another Rain book, and I thought it was a standalone. I'd never considered writing a sequel, which I know is kind of funny and even a little embarrassing in retrospect, because this is such a rich character with so many internal contradictions. There's so many uh, aspects of his being that I've had the opportunity to explore over 25 years now. But at the time, I thought it was a standalone, and now I'm like, oh my God, I have to write a sequel. So what am I going to do? And instinctively, what became my model was James Cameron's 2 movies, Terminator and Terminator 2. Because if you think about it, and my comparison was 2 other movies, but I love Terminator, and I'm not sure whether I love Terminator 2 even more. It would be an interesting conversation, but we'll have it another time. Let's just say they're both absolutely first-rate a little apples and oranges. The first one's kind of a smaller movie, tighter, a little bit more of a horror movie, and the second one it's like a bigger canvas, a little more of an action movie. But who cares? They're both fantastic movies. And then the other movies were, for anybody I'm old enough to have seen it in the theater, 48 Hours, Eddie Murphy, Nick Nolte. Absolutely hilarious action comedy, buddy movie. Really put Eddie Murphy on the map, deservedly so. But then Walter Hill did a sequel, and I think it's fair to say it was kind of a money sequel. It was like a repeat. It was called Another 48 Hours. And Walter Hill, who's a great writer director, respect. The Warriors, and I could go on and on. But he tried to just repeat the movie. So it's like nothing happened. 48 Hours is a buddy movie. So at the beginning of the movie, Nick Nolte and Eddie Murphy hate each other. But kind of underneath it, there's this affection or love, but mostly it's hate. But by the end of the movie, they've gone through this adventure together, and there's this grudging respect and affection even. Shane Black did this well in the Lethal Weapon movies, where in the first movie, right, Riggs and Murtaugh, they're oil and water, can't stand each other, can't work together. By the end of the movie, there's this affection, and they're a smoothly running machine. And Shane Black just kept building on that in the subsequent movies. He didn't pretend it didn't happen. That's the kind of sequel and series that I tend to like the most. So I felt like 48 Hours and Another 48 Hours, best example, the one that I used, was Terminator and Terminator 2, because there I thought, and I don't know what James Cameron's process is. I'd love to ask him. I watched his masterclass on writing and directing, and it was phenomenal. But he didn't really deal with this question that much in that masterclass. And the question is this, like, how do you start the next story? What are you thinking about? And I'm pretty sure this is where he started. Well, where did the last story end? Sarah Connor's gone off on this survivalist adventure. She knows the world's going to end, and she's trying to learn these skills because her son is going to become the savior of the world, and she needs to impart these skills to him. Okay. So what does that mean? It means she's telling anyone to listen, hey, the world's going to end. So we open with her in Pescadero State Mental Institution because everyone thinks she's crazy. And what does that mean for her son, who in this movie, for various reasons, he's going to be a teenager? Well, he's getting raised in foster homes because his mom is institutionalized. What kind of kid is he? Is he an honor student? No, this is John Connor. Plus, he's being raised in foster. He's a delinquent, but with some special skills and an attitude.
Mhm.
And his mom would have told him, listen, John, you're the savior of the world. He grows up in this environment, shacking up with Green Berets and whatnot, thinks he's the savior of the world. That's his whole world. Then his mom gets put in a psych ward and his whole world comes crashing down on him. And he thinks, oh my God, my mom's a psycho. It's total psycho, as he puts it. And it's bullshit. And he feels hostile to her. She lied to him. She got herself locked up. But then suddenly it all turns out to be true. It's incredible. Sorry, I have a tendency to go on too long about so many things, including movies that I love. Anyway, obviously, what James Cameron did is he didn't try to make the same movie again. He started with everything that happened in the first
Mhm.
movie, and particularly everything that happened to his characters and how those events changed his characters. And that's how I approached writing the sequel to A Clean Kill in Tokyo, which is now called A Lonely Resurrection. What happened to all the characters? What do they want based on that? What do they believe based on that? What are they doing based on
Mhm.
that? And that is how we start the new story. And I do that in every book. But you don't need to have read the previous story because I work hard to make sure each one functions also as a standalone. And I admit I can't even remember what the question I was responding to. But hopefully, somewhere in that very long answer, there's some useful information for anybody who's working on sequels.
Yeah, I don't think I actually asked a question. I just was talking about the possibility of a sequel to the system.
So the system, thank you. So yeah, there's more that can happen to Valeria, but I also wrote the story so that when you get to the end, you will feel satisfied. If you don't feel satisfied when you get to the end of any one of my novels, then I've
Mhm.
done something wrong. One other, and this one really is quick, analog is anyone who's a fan of Stranger Things. And I got to admit, I was for the first 2 seasons, but then I just wasn't as into it after that. Whatever, that happens. No disgrace to the Duffer Brothers. I watched their masterclass also, and it's excellent. But I would say, as if first season of Stranger Things, no spoilers, I just think it's superb. It's phenomenal.
Mm.
My wife and I and our daughter, we loved it. When it gets to the end and you feel like you've been on this journey, things are resolved, but then there's a thing that's not resolved and it's sufficiently unresolved so that you can see, oh, there's more that might be coming here, and I might want to tune in for season two. But you don't. It's not like it's a cliffhanger and the central stuff has not been resolved.
Right.
It's not an easy thing to do as part of the craft to make you feel both nourished from the meal you were just served, but also like still hungry enough or interested enough so that you want to come back and eat some more. That's
Good.
actually a craft challenge, and it's not always done well. I hope I've done it well in all my books, including the system. I've certainly tried to.
But I can tell you one thing that one criteria I have that tells me that I've read a really good book, and it happened with me at the end of the system, is when I'm reading something and I think to myself, "You bastard." Every once in a while, an author will get something in there, and it's either something that I should have seen coming and didn't,
Yeah,
or I'm expecting something and I get hit in the feels or something like that, and it's
yeah.
like, "Oh, man." But, yeah, I was no spoilers, was not ready for the last chapter. Even as short as it was, I was not ready for the last chapter.
Thank you. Um, yeah, I don't want to give any spoilers here, also, but uh, I mean, I hope I've written some wrenching scenes in the book.
Yeah.
It made me cry a bunch of times, so that's always a good sign. When I wrote the Livia Loan books, particularly the first one, I was at an Airbnb in Seattle for some of that because the Livia Loan is set in part in
Mhm.
Seattle. That's where Livia does her thing. And I got some ride-alongs with Seattle PD, great people, really generous with their time and their sharing their experiences. Uh, and visited all the places that appear in the books as I do. And I did a fair amount of writing in now tragically no longer with us coffee house called Uptown. I think Uptown Coffee, Uptown Espresso. And it's gone now. They raised that building. Seattle's changed a lot. But anyway, I was sitting in that coffee shop every morning with my headphones on, my laptop open, and just cry like I'm like, oh. And I was like, nobody ever bothered me, but I think they must have been thought, who is that guy? What's wrong with that guy? Does he? I know he keeps coming every morning. I guess he doesn't need help, but man. So yeah, if I think if you're not moved by your own writing, then maybe you're not doing it right. But I don't know. I don't want to speak for other writers.
Well, I will say a thing to anybody who's thinking about getting this book too. I'm not John Connor. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not a survival guy. I don't have a bunker in my backyard. But you managed to write a book with obviously what a lot of people would consider a conspiracy theory, and you wrote it in such a way where I'm reading this book and I'm like, you know, I would be 0% shocked if almost anything in this book wasn't actually happening. I think anybody who does this, and I don't think this is a spoiler. I think this is talked about at the beginning. There's an AI involved in
Mm,
the storyline,
yeah, I think that's in the jacket copy.
right? But this isn't one of those ones where this isn't person of interest. This
Mm,
isn't eagle eye.
mm.
This isn't one with an all-knowing AI that's doing everything. This is just one with a threat. Um,
That's as you'll see in the notes, that's based on stuff that's actually been reported, and you always have
right.
to figure what's been reported is the tip of the iceberg, but yeah.
But I think it makes it, especially like even if somebody who's like, oh, I don't like that conspiracy stuff. No, this is not what this book is.
No.
It may be adjacent, but it's not what a lot of people think about when they think about that type of story.
Yeah, absolutely, and the whole concept of conspiracy theories is really interesting because conspiracy theory is a term of art. It's meant to imply tinfoil hat kind of
Mhm.
stuff, but as a literal term, there are in fact conspiracies. The term
Yeah.
conspiracy is a legal term. A conspiracy to commit a crime is itself a crime, and there are elements of the crime of conspiracy in each state, and there are probably federal statutes too. So there are actually conspiracies. I mean, and anybody just go to Wikipedia, you'll find that there are all sorts of things our own government, and certainly other governments have done that qualify as conspiracies. Conspiracies are real. Well, that doesn't mean that everything that
Right.
people think was a conspiracy was in fact a conspiracy. But to think that there are no conspiracies would be naive and ahistorical in the extreme. But it's funny, conspiracies don't actually interest me that much as storytelling background or devices or whatever. I'm much more interested in what is provable
Mhm.
reality, hence all the notes. So I'm sure there are some people who might read the system and say, wait a minute, like the Pentagon has this much sway in the way in policy in the policy that's made by our elected representatives in our sacred democracy, and the Pentagon is willing to deploy this level and this nature of carrot and stick to make sure that our elected representatives are doing what the Pentagon wants to do. No, I don't buy it. And if not, I'm like, that's okay.
Mhm.
I would recommend a few books and news articles and publications in that regard. But it's all good. But I just wouldn't describe what I'm depicting here as a kind of conspiracy,
No,
uh,
no, I'm saying if
whether
somebody
whether
reads
it's true or
the
not.
jacket, they might get that feeling that this what is, and I'm saying it's not like
I
the
get it.
other type of books that I've
No,
read.
I wouldn't say so.
Yeah, yeah,
Much more an inside peek behind the curtain peek on the
yeah.
reality that we all live with in our society as it's evolved and been distorted over about 250 years. Here, I mean, I'll just say this briefly. Can I do that? I'm going to make it brief. I have to actually because we've got
Briefish.
pretty far. Yeah. If you examine your politics, where do my politics come from? I want my politics to come from to be built on a foundation of human nature. Um, Glenn Greenwald, the journalist and podcaster, describes this as first principles. I think you could call it that. I think it's a fine term. For whatever reason, I just feel it almost more like undergirding my opinions, and so I like the term foundation. But the foundation of my political views is built on my understanding of the essential qualities, the default settings of human nature across the board in all societies. The aspects of human nature that express themselves consistently in all times and in all cultures, those must be our default settings. They exist in an unwavering way. And those are the things that are going to determine the general course of any system that arises among humans. There will be different manifestations, obviously influenced by culture as it grows, all these sorts of things. But you got to start with everything you know about human nature. Otherwise, you're building a structure that's really just built on error or distortion or whatever, tribalism, ego, I don't know. I think what's axiomatic about human nature is that humans seek power. And I agree with George Orwell that the object of power is power. I also believe that power corrupts. Absolute power, sure, corrupts absolutely, but the main thing is power corrupts. I believe that the worst people in the world are attracted to power. They're already the worst people in the world. And I'm not talking about someone who wants to become an alderman to get a stop sign and placed at a
Mhm.
dangerous intersection and then feels like mission accomplished. I can go back to being a homemaker or whatever it was I was doing before I got that stop sign put in. That's not what I'm talking about. These are good people who want to accomplish good things. But the higher up the greasy pole someone
Right.
climbs, the fact that they're enduring with what that climb requires, they're still enduring it. They're not doing this for noble reasons past a certain point. These are the worst people in the world. They just are. So we're already starting with a system of elections that self-selects for the worst people, not initially, but as they climb higher and higher, we're starting to distill out the worst people, and they're being made worse by the power they acquire until finally they're like Gollum with, my precious. And you're left with the Mitch McConnells and the Nancy Pelosi's and the Joe Bidens and the Chuck Grassleys and all these 80 something year olds who Dianne Feinstein, they die in office, senile, they don't even know what month it is. Their responsibilities are being exercised by regents, our sacred democracy. Why? Because all they have is power and everything it's done to them. They can't let it go. There's just not they're a hollow husk of what a human used to be. And the only thing that animates them at all is this ring they're clutching like Gollum in the Lord of the Rings. I actually think that some of these things in the Lord of the Rings and Star Wars and the Harry Potter books are kind of reifications of aspects of human nature, and the Ring of Power is one of those things. So anyway, that's it. That's where I start. Humans seek power. The more power, the worse the person, and the worse it makes that person. And why would that be true of humans generally? But somehow the American system is this extraordinary exception to that rule. And my views about power are therefore derived from that foundational view of human nature. They're not derived from, oh, Democrats are good and Republicans are bad, or vice versa. Or these people wake up every morning thinking, how can I make life better for ordinary Americans? Are you serious? That's a fairy tale. And that's the sort of reality I try to represent in the system, not again as a conspiracy theory, but welcome to reality. Not that there's no happiness in the story. One of the questions Laura asked me early on, she said, where is the hope in this story? Because it's a dark story in many
Yeah.
ways. And that's something we talked about a lot. She's like, do you want to do Chinatown? Are you going to do Chinatown? Chinatown's got a rare downer of an ending. It is a perfect ending, but it's not an uplifting ending. I'm not saying you
Right.
need an uplifting ending, but you got to know what you're doing. And if you end a story like Chinatown, it's 2025. Not everybody wants to be crushed by the end of the story, like The Mist or something like that. So it was a really interesting thing Laura and I had to talk about. How do I present this system? But is there no hope for any of us as part of
Mhm.
this system? Or if there is, what is it? How does that play out? And that's part of that. That's become part of the story. A credit to Laura for asking the question and helping me get there too. It's a mix.
Gotcha. All right. So I'll make two comments and I'll ask you some wrap up questions because, like you said, it's we have been talking for a little bit, and I'm sure Laura's over there staring at you. But anyhow, uh, number one, I love the quotes that you had throughout the book, and the nerd in me especially loved the fact that you had one in there from Blade. And
Love that.
number
Love that one.
two, getting back to the book, one of the things we didn't talk about, but I loved not only the relationship, but the progression of the relationship, both personally and professionally, between Valeria and Preston.
Mm,
It
thank you.
seemed really, really natural. And it seemed exactly like two people that are coming from the same space
Yeah.
would naturally go, as you talk about, as one moves up the ranks of power and maybe the other one doesn't.
Yes.
So,
Yeah. Well, that's something I gave a lot of thought to. And the purpose of the thinking is to make me feel. I just want to remind people that if you're a writer, you got to feel the way the characters do. Maybe there are other ways to do that. Maybe it just happens for many people organically. But for me, it requires a lot of conscious thought that then, and with enough time, it kind of alchemizes into this feeling for the characters. And so, yeah, I just developed a good feeling for how these two characters met when neither one was anything, and what being a congressperson and the pressures of the office start to do with Valeria, and the way those pressures affect Valeria's character, and the way those changes in her character begin to affect her relationship. Going back to Stephen King for 1 second, in his book, The Shining, one of the things he did in that book that I love was, I won't get into the whole story, believe it or not, but Jack Torrance, the protagonist, he takes this job with his wife and his young son as the caretaker of a Colorado hotel in the winter when they're totally isolated. And it's going to be an opportunity for him to finish writing the great American play he's been working on. But then the hotel starts to affect him and change his personality, his worldview. And those changes get reflected in the way he looks at the characters in the play. At the outset of the story, his hero is this school, is a student at the school, at the private school, and the villain is the headmaster, the sadistic headmaster. But as Jack Torrance's personality gets perverted by the hotel, he begins to look more and more sympathetically at the sadistic headmaster, isn't he just trying to help this student? And isn't this student somewhat spoiled? I mean, he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and the headmaster didn't have any of those advantages. And he's just trying to help the student, who, after all, does he not require some discipline, blah, blah, blah. I really liked the way that played out in The Shining. And so I'm doing something similar here, where Valeria's view is changing by her exposure to power. And that changing view is affecting itself in changes, is manifesting itself in changes in her relationships, including with Preston. Yeah, I felt those things were, for me, they were so real and therefore so affecting. I hope the feedback has been good. It seems like readers are picking up on that.
I'm enjoying it. I certainly enjoyed it.
Thank you.
So couple of wrap-up questions type thing. First of all, obviously, after people pick up the system, what book should they be looking for next from you? What's coming out?
Okay, I think this is my first announcement. I was going to make it real. The next book is another Rain prequel. I've written 2 Rain prequels to date. The first is set in 1972 in Tokyo. Second is Tokyo in 1982. This one is Tokyo and environs 1989, the height of the asset bubble, when the asset bubble is about to burst. It's extremely interesting time in Japan, when the land under the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was worth more than the land in the entire state of California. When people like Michael Crichton were writing books like Rising Sun, Japan is going to annihilate America. Theodore White, historian, wrote an article, I still remember, cover of the New York Times Sunday magazine. I don't remember the title, but the gist of it was, only now, 50 years later, or 45 years later, or whatever it was, will we know who actually won World War II. This was the way Japan was being looked at in America at the time. It was a fascinating time. And then the bubble burst, also a fascinating time. So the milieu is that moment of hysteria when the music is about to stop. Who are all the players who sense the music is about to stop, or don't sense? A lot of different factions. I love that in a story. It's like a Maltese Falcon thing. I actually don't really care that much about my plots. I think they're good plots, but the truth is, it's always just a way of getting all the characters into action and making crazy things happen in their lives that they have to deal with in some way. The first Rain prequel you can think of is Rain goes from naive, relatively speaking, CIA bagman to fledgling assassin. That's a Graveyard. Yeah, exactly. We've all done that. Graveyard of Memories is that book, 72 in Tokyo. The next prequel rather, Zero Sum, set in 82. And that's the story of how Rain goes from fledgling assassin to master. In this third book, I have a working title, but I'm not going to mention it because it might change. This is the story of a last chance to escape the wheel of fate. Bit of a different kind of story than the previous ones, but that's the story. And in some ways, the model for this one, model high level. I'm never trying to imitate anyone else, but if we're being honest, as Cormac McCarthy said, books come from books. We're influenced by all sorts of things, including other books. And one of my big influences as a writer is a guy named Trevanian, whose most famous book is Shibumi. Made a huge impact on me. I mean, anyone who knows Shibumi, Nikolai Hell, the character, or Trevanian's other assassin books, the Jonathan Hemlock books, that's the Eiger Sanction and the Lou Sanction, you'll recognize that those books had an influence on me and were part of the inspiration for a character like John Rain. But Trevanian wrote another book that's not nearly as well known, I think. And in some ways, I think it's his best, although Shibumi is a masterpiece. And that book is The Summer of Katya. It's unlike his other books because it's not driven by big government conspiracies and assassins and global conglomerates vying for power and all that great stuff. It's a very quiet book set in the Basque country between the wars. Like a tight focus, not global. It's just this small place at a very specific time, and it's gorgeous and so moving and compelling. Uh, it almost feels like a weird time out from his previous books. It's gorgeous. Anyway, that high level is the kind of book I envision writing for this third prequel. But I've only just started it, and it might change. They always do. So we'll see. That's what's coming.
Well, somebody graduated high school in 1989. I'm looking forward to that. See what that has to say.
Yeah, it was
And
an
then,
interesting time.
what are you reading right now, if anything?
Well, hang on.
You came prepared.
I didn't really, but this is something I'm reading sections of it again for background. The Clash by my previous history professor Walt Lefebvre, who was a great and good man and died a few years ago after having an enormous impact on his profession and thousands of people who had the privilege of studying under him. I'm very sorry he's not here now for me to talk about this book with, because he would have been a fascinating resource and those would have been great conversations. He became a friend after I studied under him, and he was just really a wonderful person. But so that's what I'm rereading right now, sections of that book, to remind myself of the milieu. Actually, not the milieu of when the bubble burst, but the post-war, the occupation of Japan, because the antagonist of this book, in certain ways, got his start during the U.S. occupation of Japan from 1945 onward. Also, I mean, imagine it, incredibly interesting time. And I've read various books about this time. But what the West's changing views on what to do with Japan? Oh, the war's over. Before we were hating Imperial Japan, and they need to be defanged. But on the other hand, now we have a new Cold War with the Soviet Union, and that means we need to look at Japan another way. We need to do certain things within the Japanese power structure. We need to rehabilitate people we were going to prosecute as war criminals, make their pasts go away. The CIA is heavily involved in this. The Yakuza, Japanese rightists. It's an incredible time. It's not the time I'm writing about, but it is the cauldron in which the antagonist of this book emerges from. So I need to refresh my recollection. And that means Walt's book, The Clash, which is I would recommend for anybody who's interested in the history of U.S.-Japanese relations going all the way back. It's a typically meaning Walt Lefebvre wrote it, typically marvelous book. And it's really a bit of a distracting pleasure to go back to it. Laura's always reminding me, she's like, it's fiction, Barry. It doesn't have to be. And I'm like, I know. But so that's what I'm, and then one more that I just got. Was this another part of my research? This one I just ordered because it's a description by a journalist of Tokyo right in this era. The first time I encountered Tokyo firsthand was 1991, and I wasn't there for very long. So this was after the bubble had burst. And then Laura and I lived there for a year in 93, 94, and we've been there innumerable times since then. Anyway, one of the things I do if I'm writing a book that's in a different era is try to visit the place, the parts of the place that haven't changed that much from that era. And there's a lot you can find on the internet, obviously, old video sometimes, but certainly old photographs. But I'll also try to find books that describe or have photographs of or whatever that era, so that I come back to that word feel again. I'm not trying to write a scholarly treatise on Tokyo, what Tokyo was like in 1989. I'm trying to feel what it was like, and then to try to convey that feeling on the page. There's a saying I like. It's a little bit of a cliche, but there's a lot of truth to it, like many cliches. Don't describe the rain, describe the way the rain feels. That's the job of the novelist. If you're just doing tab A, slot B, or the mechanics of any action, but the reader doesn't feel it, then you're not doing the novelist's job. You may be doing, like, if you're writing about martial arts, you may be doing a great how-to book on martial arts. I don't know. And there's a place for that in this world. I use those books to get things right. And I've learned a lot from them when I used to be doing martial arts myself. But your job as a novelist is to make people feel what you're depicting on the page. And all this background reading and viewing and traveling ultimately is for the aim of I can feel it myself, and then I try to translate that into words that will make you feel it yourself.
And as much as I would never dream of contradicting Laura, you know, as
Hope
an
not.
author, that if you write a book and you set in 1989 and you put something in there that didn't exist until 1990,
Yeah,
somebody's going to point it out.
every time. And that's why if I'm going to deliberately do something like that, I'll call it out and explain my reasons
Yeah.
because I want people to trust me. It is
Mhm.
fiction. I'll change things.
Right.
But if I'm changing something from reality, I'll let you know because I want you to trust my depiction of reality. And if I make a mistake, and I do, I've changed my process over the years. It's much better now. It's more interesting and satisfying for me. I'm more effective at preventing mistakes, but nothing's foolproof. We're all human. And so on those occasions when I get some reader feedback in email or whatever saying, hey, just so you know, Mr. Eisler, you described this street as in Paris as being one way, but actually there is the other side of the street, whatever. Put that on my website. There's a link called Mistakes that people have sent me over the years that readers really seem to find interesting. And I do it primarily because I do want people to trust me. So if a mistake slips through my process of research and checking with experts before publication and that sort of thing, trust me to acknowledge the mistake. You can't trust anyone to be perfect. There are no perfect people. What I think can be the basis for trust, or at least confidence, is this person being honest about having made a mistake? And is he or she honestly grappling with the reasons for the mistake and also implementing a system to make mistakes less likely? That's how I gauge people.
Yeah.
And I wish journalists would do this a little more, but they don't. I'm just a novelist. And I'm like, hey, if I make a mistake, I will tell you about it. And I invite people to tell me about mistakes in my novels. Tell me if you find a typo. I hate typos and I'll correct it, but I'm not going to put that on the mistakes page because it just doesn't add to anyone's understanding. But substantive mistakes for sure.
It's a weird thing. Typos don't bother me as much in a book because I know, it got missed. But for some reason, if I'd see a typo in an ebook, I'm like, this is an ebook. I should be able to fix it.
It's fair. It's interesting that would affect our expectations,
Uh,
and it makes sense.
but yeah, it's not just authors too. I mean, let's face it, there are people who really bored people who will be watching a movie in 1945 going, that's a 47 Buick. And it's like, stop it, back off, chill.
Yeah, but you know what?
It fit the
if
picture.
if
Come
you're
on.
going to change something like that, then do it knowingly because some people will
Yeah.
call it out and it'll jerk them out of the story, which you never want to do. So, as my friend novelist Joe Conrath, J.A. Conrath, likes to say, be deliberate. And he's not telling you what to do, but just be aware of the cost and benefits. Why are you doing it? And make a deliberate decision rather than an accidental one that's going to rely on luck. And maybe in this case, you'll irritate people with a mistake for no reason. You didn't think about what you were receiving from the mistake. You just made it, and it was nothing but cost.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, last two. One, anything besides writing, hobby, skill, achievement that you like to talk about because sometimes you like to talk about something besides writing.
Um, well, my hobby is reading and thinking and writing about all this human nature, political media stuff, and it's merged with my novel thing. I mean, I try to work out most days. Uh, so that, and all right, I'll just say this one thing because again, maybe it's useful. I have become, this sounds like a job interview, but obviously it isn't. Like you try to describe the weaknesses but it's actually a strength. They're like, what are your weaknesses? And you're like, I'm too much of a perfectionist.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just a slave to work. I've tried to cut back, but I just give too much to the corporation and I don't know what to do about that. Obviously you're not, you're really presenting that as a way to pitch yourself. I'm not doing that here. It's certainly not something I'm pleased or proud about, but I have become a little too focused on these things that are not unimportant. One is the day job, and the other is a lot of the background reading, thinking, and writing that feeds into the day job. And there's nothing wrong with that. I find these things inherently satisfying, as there's nothing wrong with doing a lot of them. But what I've realized is there's not as much room for whimsy in my life as I think there should be. By whimsy, I mean just a thing that blows your hair back and you're just doing it for no reason. I mean, even the exercise for me is like I don't do martial arts anymore. So it's I got the heavy bag and the speed bag and the Focus Master in my garage, and I smack that stuff around. It's good for me, although it's
Mhm.
bugging my shoulder a little as I get older. Um, but even that's just like I work out now to stay in shape, to feel good, to to slow the trajectory, to like make the angle of descent a little less steep. It's
Yeah.
kind of purpose driven rather than it's not that I don't enjoy it at all. I do still enjoy working out, but it's not like when I used to roll around on the mat, and that was just joyous in its own right. So I would just like to get the balance right a little bit. And what I've taken to doing is I don't have it in front of me, otherwise I'd show it. But I have it's a coffee table book, really, called City of Darkness, about Kowloon Walled City, which was this incredible slum, really, in Hong Kong that started taking shape. God, when? Right after one of the Opium Wars, I forget which one. And then the Japanese occupied Hong Kong during World War II, and then were kicked out. British retook it. It started. Think of it as a fort, and then it
Mhm.
grew into a slum after World War II. It was demolished in 1993, and this is a picture book of this extraordinary, unique structure, in which at one point 35,000 people lived there. The photos and firsthand accounts are absolutely fascinating. And so I've tried to turn off the computer earlier in the evening and go downstairs and either make myself an herbal tea or pour myself a single malt whiskey, depending on my feeling, and
Maybe
just
both.
read this book and look at the photographs of lives that were lived in this place, experiences that were had. Most of these people are gone now because the book came out decades ago. I forget the first edition did anyway. Um, there's no particular reason I'm doing this other than just being alive for a little while uh, on this ride and wanting to just see how other people lived in faraway places and what were their experiences like. But even this, it's funny, it's affecting me, and I'm thinking, could there be a scene in the new book? The timing is right. 1989, the walled city was Kowloon walled city was still there. Could Rain have to go there to do a job? And I'm like, maybe. But that's not a bad thing. You
No.
start with whimsy, you start with passion, and if you indulge it enough and you're a writer, it will start to creep into the way you think about stories. That's not a bad thing. But I just don't want everything I do to be purpose driven. I mean, anyone who wants to live that way, if it's working for you, then go for it. But I think it's good to just do things just because they
Yeah.
let you up.
Well,
Also.
hey, I haven't had to use it yet, but thanks to your writing, I know what an SDR is. So,
And it can keep you safe. That's a surveillance detection run.
yeah,
And anyone who's curious about these things, spycraft like surveillance detection runs, I've got these articles I've written on my website. Personal safety tips from assassin John Rain, because the stuff he uses to stay alive after all these decades in the business he's in, those will keep you safer against ordinary crime too.
perfect, perfect. Last question. I always ask everybody. Uh, I don't have a problem if you don't have a store near you. You want to shop at Amazon, that's fine. But Amazon's never going to bring your favorite author to town to do a book signing.
Yep. So
Just a
far.
shout out to a brick and mortar bookstore or more of your choice.
Yeah, that would be Kepler's in Menlo Park. Kepler's with a K and a
Yeah,
P. P as in Paul, Ler apostrophe S. And I have launched every one of my books at Kepler's, um, starting with the very first one in 2002, and there are 19 now total. So it's a phenomenal bookstore. They've got autographed editions of all my books. They have great author and other speaker events. Actually, got to make a couple introductory remarks there a month or two ago. Joan Baez was in the store just talking about all kinds of stuff, including a picture book she's done. I was one of the people who introduced her. And as I passed her and the person interviewing her a microphone, I got a hug from Joan Baez, which immediately gave me even more cred with my daughter Emma than I might otherwise have had. And in my house, I now call it the night Joan Baez gave me a hug. But most people would think of it as the Joan Baez Kepler's event. So that's Kepler's. That's Kepler's, a really special bookstore. And again, if you want a signed copy of the books, Kepler's is the place to go.
Gotcha.
Or to
Extra
order it
points
from.
with the daughter, fewer points with the wife. Got it. No, just
No,
kidding.
no, she was about it too. She
I'm
she was
just
she was there
teasing.
too, and it was Joan Baez is 70 something and just a force. Like some
Mhm.
people just have a kind of life force that I don't think can be taught. It's just a gift of the gods. And she's got that for sure. She's really a delight to listen to. And I promise I don't say that about most speakers. I try to avoid most speakers actually, because in my experience, the signal to noise ratio isn't usually worth it.
Gotcha, gotcha. All right. Well, thank your wife for giving you up for the morning.
I
Appreciate
will
that.
do that.
And thank you for hopping on here. Like I said, I've been a fan. This replaced when I got this because at this age with these eyes, I like the trade paperbacks more. Replaced a very beat up, very old copy of Rainfall.
Thank you.
So I've been reading you for quite a while. Oh, I was going to ask you one last question. I forgot to ask. Do I remember seeing something about Rain maybe having some screen time at some point?
Well, there was a 2009 movie that I think was inspired by my first book. It's called Rainfall. Mostly Japanese language production. Gary Oldman actually played Holzer, my
Yep.
antagonist. But I, you could think of the movie as being inspired by
No,
the
I
book.
remember that one. I was trying to think. I could have sworn. Maybe I'll cut this part off. I could have sworn I
No. Oh,
remembered
I see.
seeing
No, no,
something
you're right.
newer.
Apple Television and a production company called Pure Fiction and another production company called Seesaw Productions recently optioned the television rights, not just to the Rain books, but to all my books, to the whole Killer Collective universe, as Laura and I like
Nice.
to call it. The title of my first really big mashup is the Killer Collective, so we
Right.
call it the KCU Killer Collective Universe. You know, a bit of an homage to the Marvel Cinematic Universe (MCU), and may the KCU become anywhere near as big as the MCU, but one step at a time. Pure Fiction is the company that did Shogun, that put together Shogun.
Nice.
Seesaw Productions does, and by the way, Shogun. I loved the book back in the day. Wow. Um, the Hulu television show is phenomenal.
It
Loved it.
was. Yeah.
Likewise, this Apple show, Slow Horses, based on McHerron's books. Wow, phenomenal. And it's funny, Gary Oldman's in Jackson Lamb. He's in the Apple Slow Horses show, which Laura and I are obsessed with. I'm just obsessed with it. We just finished, I think it was the 5th season, and now we're bereft. But there's going to be a 6th and a 7th. Anyway, so really nice pedigree here between Shogun and the one company and Slow Horses, which is obviously got Japan in it. Slow Horses, which is espionage, quite a different and at times hilarious, but also quite dramatic take on the flawed humans who inhabit the world of intelligence. That's Slow Horses on the other. And of course, having Apple TV behind the whole thing is huge. We're still a long way away from an
Right.
actual television show. And I've been to this rodeo before. Yeah. So it's not that it's made me cynical. I just don't want to get overly excited. A lot of things can go wrong to stop a show, and any one of those things can happen. But obviously, these players
Mhm.
having the rights to my Reign and the other books is a significantly positive development. So if anyone's interested in seeing my characters on the screen, keep your fingers crossed, and let's hope that it goes the distance this time.
As long as they cast it right. All right. But
Let's
yeah,
hope.
no, I understand. I know a lot of authors too, though, are like, I don't even care if they make the show as long as they option it every 18 months. I'll keep taking the check.
Yeah, Elmore, rather James Elroy used to joke about this because, for example, Black Dahlia took a decade to make it to the screen. And at the time, we had the same agent. So I think it was my agent who must have mentioned that James Elroy's attitude was this is an annuity. All his books were under option. I mean, it's money, it's subrights money. And the way I look at it is if somebody options my books, I a certain amount of effort went into the writing of book X, let's just call it.
Mhm.
And then the nice thing is it scales, to use, I think, software terminology. Like a friend of mine pointed this out. It seems obvious, although I'd never thought of it in these terms. He's like, you're in a business that scales. That's great. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, if you cut hair for a living, you're limited. Like you can only cut one head of hair at a time. And maybe think you can become more efficient. Maybe you train some other barbers and they become part of your operation. Maybe even franchise it at some point. That would start to scale. But in general, one head of hair at a time, 8 hours in a day, what can you do? But if you make a certain amount of effort writing, put in a certain amount of effort to writing a book, how many copies does the book sell? That's not driven by how much effort you invested in writing the book
Right.
to begin with. Again, I know it's funny. I've spent so much time on social media that the naysayers, I don't want to say they get in my head, but they make me pressure check the argument and adjust it so that people who want to instinctively do what humans do, which is to find some alleged weak point or even a straw man in the argument so they can try to destroy the whole thing instead of listening and deriving what value they can from the point being made. Yes, if you market the book successfully, if you have the right partners and there's a good cover and the blah, 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 you'll increase your odds of success. Yes, it's not totally determined. The book's success is not totally determined by how much effort you invested in the writing of it. But in general, the book can scale. If it sells 100 copies, you make a certain amount of money per copy. If it sells a million copies, you make a lot more, and you made the same investment in writing the book. True too for foreign language rights. Sell some more foreign language rights, you make more from that initial investment. Film, television rights, ditto. So it's pretty exciting that you do an option sale when you do an option sale on a book you've written, because it's just more revenue from that initial investment. That's great. And I've had that before. And I don't object to it ever. Never return a
No.
check, Stephen King said. But it would be really interesting. And there'd be a lot more money in it if someone could actually make a successful television show based on these characters. And I think there's a lot in the books that would be great on the screen. And I'm not talking about the action, actually. The action would also be great if it's done right, obviously. If it's got that reality foundation that informs the action on the pages of the books. But usually when people say to me, "Oh, your book, I read your book, whatever, and I think it'd make a great movie," they're not, or a great television show. I don't think they're wrong, but I think they're reacting to the obvious surface elements. Sure, who doesn't want to see great action on the screen? But it's the character dilemmas and
Right.
contradictions and their struggles with in this heightened context of violence and political skullduggery, their struggles with the sort of struggles that will resonate with anyone, because they're things all of us humans have to struggle with, all the questions we face and the limitations we grapple with. That's the stuff that I think could, if done right, be distilled out and amplified visually in a way that would make these books and these characters great television. It hasn't been done yet. We'll see. We'll see. And if it's only an annuity, don't feel sorry for me. It's nice to have an annuity.
No complaints. I just remembered I'd seen something about it being optioned, and I was just seeing if there's anything new.
Yeah, that announcement was in August, so that's
Gotcha.
ongoing.
Perfect. All right. I am going to wrap you up this time though, just because this time I was going to be quiet, and then I just kept coming out with something else.
No, I think
But
this was mostly my fault, but thank you.
all right, appreciate you. All right, but once again, like I said, everybody go pick up the system. I think this book is good for almost everybody. You can't, like you said, you can't say everybody. There's going to be somebody who's like, "Oh, I don't like the fact that there's a sex scene," or
Sure.
somebody's going to have a fit. But in general, I feel like this is much more open to people who maybe aren't into as much as I'm into the thrillers like A Clean Kill in Tokyo. If they're looking for that more cerebral and character focused novel and less of the action, I think this is going to be right up their alley. Uh, and I think you're going to fall in love with Monty. That's just my 2 cents.
A lot of people seem to react well to him. I know I
All
did.
right. Appreciate you, Barry, and looking forward to your next book.
Thank you, Everett. Thanks for having me on. It was fun talking. Cheers.